Okay, go for it.
Fabulous. Well, hello and welcome to episode 123, that's 123, of the Adoption and Fostering podcast with me, Scott Casson-Rennie.
Me, Al Coates.
And me, Becky Brooks.
Whee!
Hello!
That was
Becky's in the
seamless.
house.
Absolutely seamless. Well done, Becky.
Wow. It only took us 35 minutes to rehearse that.
Oh, dear.
Yes. Well, we got Becky on today because Becky has single-handedly, off their own bat, produced the Adoption Barometer for Adoption UK. Can we say that?
No.
Okay. Well, in that case, with a crack team of thousands of minions, she's been the figurehead of the production of the Adoption Barometer, and I thought it would be really good to get you on to talk about that, because that was released 4 weeks ago now, so it's been widely circulated. Is it something like that? Beginning of July it came out, end of June?
29th of June, I think. I've been on holiday twice since then, recovering.
Saint-Tropez.
So frankly, it's Costa del Wales, actually. Wales, very nice.
Oh, very nice.
Very nice, yeah.
But before we get into the long grass, how about you tell us what you've been doing since we last saw you in December, last time we spoke at our Christmas hoo-ha.
I've been writing the Adoption Barometer.
That was a great conversation.
It was delayed, wasn't it, because of COVID? The report.
Not really. No, the last one was
was
delayed.
it not?
Yeah, no, it's been a bit awkward because the first one came out in June, and then the second one was delayed because of COVID, and we didn't bring it out till September.
Right. Okay.
So basically, we got the last barometer out, and then about 4 weeks later, I started preparing for the next barometer.
So basically, it's Becky Brooks, barometer extraordinaire.
Like Mrs. Barometer. So since Christmas, nothing terribly exciting. In common with many people, I have stayed at home an enormous amount, and done the barometer and other. I would love to have something exciting to tell you, but no, sorry, nothing.
I can't believe that there's nothing exciting happening.
This is why I don't come on more often, isn't it? What have you been doing? Nothing. No.
Watch some telly.
Yeah.
But on a really serious note, are you not going a bit stir crazy just doing the barometer for like 3 years solid?
No, because I'm a desperate nerd. So I mean, it's entirely my cup of tea. The schedule is that in November and December, I start sorting out the questionnaires and sorting out the survey questions, which obviously gets a bit easier after the first one. Took absolutely ages, obviously, but a lot of it's carried over. So November and December is that, finalising the question sets, and we had a bit extra this year because we included the survey for adopted adults and young people, so that was all new, and obviously that had to be. We did that in conjunction with a group of adopted adult volunteers, really, who just came and talked over the questions and helped us to get them right, to be honest. And then the survey goes out in January, February, and I do other things while we're collecting data, and I do have some other things that I occasionally do. And then really between the end of March, so I'll get the data at the end of March, and then I have 6 or 7 weeks to crunch the data, filter it by every nation, and do all the maths, and then write the basic report. And then the rest of the time after that, so I'd done the first draft by just about the 3rd week in April. And then the rest of the time after that is like, but I like that bit, it's fun, and nobody bothers me because I'm doing the barometer, so I just
What about your kids?
No.
Yeah, and your husband.
Yeah, watch TV, kids. I'm doing the barometer.
As if
the kids watch TV anymore. My kids haven't watched TV ever. They don't watch TV. It's all YouTube. Anyway, whatever.
Yeah,
and then it goes out
not
to
into
all.
YouTube, are they?
Yeah. I have to listen to Preston Plays. That's free advertising for Preston Plays. And then there's this whole long process of the draft goes out, and then people look at the draft, and it's all sort of
all the grown-ups.
All the grown-ups look at the draft, and particularly to make sure that it's reflecting properly what's going on in the nations, and I haven't accidentally misnamed some really important piece of legislation or blah, 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 or missed anything vital. And then it goes out to design, and there's a whole thing of design.
Right,
and that's
to be honest, I've lost interest.
No, but people show me. Well, me too. By then, because then what happens is people start going, "Do you like these? Look at these 15 photos. Which one do you think will be on the front cover?"
Which kid looks the saddest?
I don't care. I don't care.
That's not my bag, really. And everything that's given to me by the designer, I'm just like, "Oh, that's great. Yeah, brilliant. Love it. Yeah, great."
Your husband is a martyr.
It's hilarious. So it actually, although it's like a big deal and it does take a lot of time, not as much of that time is me doing it as you might think, actually.
See, I find it interesting that you say you take 6 weeks to crunch numbers, filter it by nation, blah, 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 all that sort of stuff. I mean, 6 weeks, that would take me about 6 years to do something like that. There is no way in this world. I wouldn't have the focus and the concentration to do it for a start. And secondly, yeah. I mean, I'm glad you do it, Becky. Don't get me wrong, but
someone's got to do it.
Yeah, someone has to do it.
I mean, no one really has to do it, but I could do that and only that. I could do the barometer as my full-time job, and then the reason why is because it's a 200 and something question survey, and even though this year's report is like flipping War and Peace, and like I got a paper copy through the post and nearly died. What if I created this monster? I could probably write probably 2 or 3 times as much again on all the deep dive into the data that we just I don't have as much opportunity to do. That's not fair. I mean, there's some opportunities to do that, but you could really spend all of you as a full-time job just analysing and preparing reports on barometer data, which you should be probably glad that I'm not doing that.
Yeah, well, I'm just glad that you are a geeky nerd, because if not, then we wouldn't have the barometer, would we? It's
my niche.
Well, we maybe would have it, but it would be by somebody else. So.
It would be just
I feel like I lived through that experience, that explanation. I genuinely feel like I lived through it.
Did you have flashes of things?
If I had to do anything like that, the family would have to hide the sharp things, because after about 35 minutes, I'd be pacing, rocking.
It's just personality types, isn't it? Because the entire time I'm doing the barometer, I don't have to have any meetings. I don't have to actually speak to any people. I'm just like, sorry, barometer. Sorry, no barometer. Sorry.
Champion.
It's either now like that. Just like perfect. In a cupboard typing. Yeah, it's good.
Yeah, perfect. So the barometer, before we come on to some of the detail about it, tell us, the new adoption strategy came out this week. And Al and I have discussed it already, clearly, because we did our live the other night. For anybody who's missed it, you can skip back one episode and you can listen to that and you can hear us waffle on about it. What?
Your social media training's paying fruit there. That was freaking awesome.
Well done.
Yeah, it was, wasn't it? So skip back one episode. Just briefly, Becky, because we know that you have opinions. Thankfully, because if you didn't, then you wouldn't be here. Yeah, exactly. Don't grit your teeth like that, Becky. What's your brief thoughts on the strategy? Brief.
Full disclosure, I haven't read it all. So I've read up to the part where it talks about education, and then I just faded into.
Lost interest.
I kind of struggled a bit after that. And I think that's because the part that obviously is of most interest to me, which is the education part, I did find somewhat kind of vague and a bit disappointing, really. There are some really concrete things that could be done, and I just found it a bit just not, I always hope for more. We always hope for more. We keep hoping for more. And I think other than that, I think there are some nod towards some things that I think are quite encouraging. There's a nod towards the sort of lifespan of an adopted person, just an acknowledgement of the existence of adopted people beyond recruitment and placement, which is something. And I think some sort of reference to transition to adulthood and what it means to be an adopted adult, and that there's a reference to that. I did think there were some confusing messages around. This was just something that I picked up on. I don't know if other people really felt this, but I thought there was a little bit of confusing message around whose voice needs to be at the centre of things.
Yes.
I haven't listened to your previous thing about
obviously,
this. But there was a bit of a confusing paragraph that talked about adopter voice being at the centre of it, and there's some good practice of this. For example, this RA has got an adoptee on the panel of it. And I'm like, that's really great, but you were talking about adopt a voice. And if you're talking about adopted people voices, that's really important too. I think we just perhaps need to clarify who we're talking about. And there was talk about the voice of the child being at the centre, and that obviously is really important. But that also misses out the voices of those older adopted people that, so I thought there was a bit of, I think there could be being a bit more clarity there, really. And I guess we're just relying on RAAs and in education, virtual schools, actually. A lot of emphasis put on those to just do stuff. I'd want to see commitment to something to back that up, really. Like money, really. Or, like new policy, statutory guidance, or strengthening of legislation, or, But there are some positive things in there. It's a game of two halves. But I think there were some positive things in there as well. It wasn't...
Well, it's interesting you talk about the legislation thing, because how long has this government got left to go? Do any of us know? Because I've not got a clue, because I don't live in Britain.
When was the election? I don't know.
I think it's some sort of like Mount Doom, end of the world, Mordor thing going on, and it's probably here forever now. If I was a better policy advisor, I would have that information at the tip of my fingertips.
No, I was just wondering, because obviously legislation takes a bit of time, doesn't it?
December 24.
Oh, okay. So there's still a while, So they could have introduced something into kind of that process, couldn't they? Maybe.
Yeah.
Oh, well.
Maybe.
Hey ho. Let's not get stuck in the long grass of the strategy.
No, exactly. Yeah.
It'll be chewed over for years to come, no doubt.
Of course it will. Yeah. I mean, from our perspective, or from my perspective, because I would never think to speak for anybody else, but I think there was a certain amount of it that was just regurgitated, and we've heard a lot of it before, and I mean, it's just it could have been a little bit better. That's my.
I think we could always I think it can always be better, but I did think there was some direction of travel that was more encouraging. I thought. I think I just would phrase it in that way. The direction of travel seems a bit more. Yeah. Yeah.
I guess it was not a groundbreaking, perhaps like the Vision 2020 that came out of the blue.
Exactly.
That's real, like, wow, we're going to do this and we're going to do that. It felt just like a more of the same, bit of a tinker here, there. The RA's lead is probably the only thing. Yeah. But anyway,
and I think there are probably things in the existing legislation that are not fully bearing fruit yet, and so what we do need to do is not write new legislation in some case. I mean, I can only really talk about education, but people are often saying to me, well, they should make sure this, they should make sure that, and I'm like, oftentimes, actually, the legislation and statutory guidance exists to ensure that supposedly happens, but the problem is coming in the way that that's being implemented day to day. And I'm not an expert on the whole adoption landscape, but I will suspect there's an element of that as well, that there may be legislation and guidance to support certain things we'd like to see happening. But then there's sometimes a gap between, as the barometer demonstrates.
Oh, nice.
Ta-da! There's sometimes a gap between, the policy that's written down and the actual lived experiences of people, whether that's due to just, whether that's resourcing or expertise or whatever reason that is. So there's some of that as well.
But you see that in things like the national minimum standards that have been around for 10 years, and there's things in there that people go, it's a requirement that I get a life letter. It's a requirement that I get life story work. It's a requirement. All these things that, like you say, so that often when you dig down, it's there. Yeah. But it's just not being done. So that's the key thing, isn't it? Which maybe is the RAA. The RAA lead is the person who's going to maybe push to get some of that brought to, into practice.
Yeah.
Anywho, Adoption Barometer. So this year... Yeah. Sorry, Scott, you were going to say something there?
No, I was just going to say, before you jump in, because I'll never get a word in after he starts talking. So I just wanted to ask Becky about the adopted adults and young people. Was there a big kind of was there a large number of those that took part in the barometer this year?
It depends what you mean by large number. No, I mean, I think I'm going to have to say by most, obviously,
all right, Bojo.
Adoption UK's reach amongst the adopted adult community is nothing like the reach that it has amongst obviously adoptive parent community, this is not the first time we've put out surveys for adopted young people, adults and children, actually. And we had 159 full, complete responses from adopted adults, ranging in age from people who were adopted in the 1960s or earlier, up into those who were adopted in the 2000s. So you had to be 16 to fill it in. So we did have quite the span. More of the respondents were at the younger age, but they did, it did go right back. I would have liked I would have liked to have top 200 really, but I think it's approaching people that may not really know where they stand with Adoption UK as an organisation, and that may not historically have had an awful lot of involvement, and that very much see Adoption UK as an organisation that's for adoptive parents, which historically that's how it began, isn't it? As rooted in peer support, which is obviously still like massively part of what Adoption UK does. But I think from my perspective, looking at policy and advocacy, having the input from adopted people is really essential. So it's just well recognised in the sort of nature of the organisation of Adoption UK. So it's a bit of a thing, really. I kind of get why it's potentially slightly slow inroad sometimes into encouraging people that have not had much dealings with you to respond to your survey, not knowing how it's going to be used, not knowing how they're going to be represented. And this is a trust relationship that needs to be built up, really. Yeah. I think.
Yeah. I mean, there's very few,
interesting.
If any, kind of organisations that
That's
actually.
What I was going to say.
Yeah. So, the opportunity to take part in a survey like this, I'm on it tonight, Coates. Mind yourself, mate.
You are.
I'll be taking off
I will.
shortly. So there's very few opportunities for them to do this. So I think that's an all right start, isn't it? But,
Yeah. I mean, I think ideally there would be strong, strong organisations run by and representing adopted people that we can collaborate and work with, and I think that's beginning to happen. In fact, only tonight I was booking pre-booking a course with what's it called? Shania's
Adoptee Futures.
Yes. Retweeting and like trying to book on. I mean, I couldn't book on because it's pre-booking, but I've like pre-booked. Partly because I'm really interested in going on the course, because I think it'll be brilliant, and partly because I really want that to exist, right? So I just think you need to put your money where your mouth is on that. I really want that organisation to exist, and I really want that training to be happening, and for people to be able to access it. And so I think, whatever, let's put the money down and go on the course, because it will be brilliant and it will support this organisation. So I think, I mean, those are avenues for the future, isn't it? But it'd be great to see more of that going on, and see what collaboration and information perspective sharing, I guess, or what fruitful things can be said and done. Yeah.
And just to link to that, I mean, Shania and Adoptee Futures, they're taking part in our annual conference in November. So if you'd like a ticket, then visit our website, noborderstraining.org, and you can get your ticket there. Sorry, just a little ad there. Little ad break.
You're on fire. You are on fire.
I tell you, I'm shocking myself tonight, seriously.
I know, crikey, you've had your Vimto. I do think, I mean, I suppose we're not really onto the barometer yet, are we? Not with actual findings, but I do think it's interesting, isn't it, from like you as an Adoption UK rep. I mean, you are a rep, but you're not, you speak for yourself. But there's a... Well, you know what I mean. But there's a community of adopted adults who don't necessarily want to align themselves to Adoption UK for just obvious reasons. They just, they think, well, you're there to promote adoption and to promote adopters, and we're not adopters. We don't want to be aligned to that, even though they may not feel any. It's no acrimony. So it does make sense.
No, I understand that. I mean, I would slightly take issue with the idea that Adoption UK exists to promote adoption. I'm not sure that was what. Not that I was there 50 years ago when it was set up. I'll be honest.
Around the kitchen table.
I'm not sure that's what. Around the kitchen table. But I don't think that's what the people who originally met together and began the organisation. I don't think they had promoting adoption necessarily as one of the key factors. I understand it to be more about like adoptive parents supporting other adoptive parents, but obviously over 50 years, things have changed.
But I can
from my
understand how
side
people
of it,
from the
I do.
outside would see it as
Yes,
that.
I can see that, and there's a lot of confusion about what Adoption UK does. Sometimes people think we're an agency, so you get random emails. Just the kind of sometimes like direct marketing emails I'll get to my email account. Clearly, it's people who think that we're an adoption agency that plays children for adoption, which obviously Adoption UK isn't. Random.
I remember do you know what? When I worked for Adoption UK, I used to get exactly the same thing. And
So I mean, there's it's.
What do you do with them? Sorry.
It's tricky. So it can be a bit, it can be a bit tricky. But I think really, as I said, there is a trust relationship that needs to be worked on. Not that, but it's a relationship that I think can be developed, but with the understanding that our experiences are not the same. Adoptive parents don't know what it's necessarily like to be adopted people, and vice versa necessarily.
Yeah.
Right. So let's get to the guts of the barometer then. So tell me what. Obviously, people can read it. It's in there. It's on the Adoption UK website.
If you've got an hour, if you've got an hour, it's quite long.
It is. But it's quite.
And try not reading it without hearing Becky's accent in the background.
Yeah.
Like when I'm reading it, I read it like in my head.
Read it in Northern,
because I know she's written it
in broad Lancashire. Bayek is like. So there's a summary of recommendations that kind of is 6 recommendations, but then it's broken down into sections where there's recommendations. So was there anything in this barometer that came as a surprise to you, or was it kind of just more of the same? And
we ask this every time.
Every single person asks me this every single time.
Forget it then.
So what I'm going to say is no. You asked me last time. What I'm going to say is this almost a rehearsed answer, but this is just true. Not massively, because a lot of the questions we've asked before, and we wouldn't expect an enormous change in one calendar year. But I think one of the things, there were a couple of things related to COVID that came as a surprise. I'd probably assumed that it would have been taking people a lot longer to get through approvals and matching during COVID. Didn't seem to be. Not from our respondents anyway.
Right.
There was mixed feelings about whether COVID had been a good thing or a bad thing for adoptive families. I mean, it's been a bad thing for every family, don't get me wrong, sorry. Let me rephrase that. There were mixed feelings about whether the impact of COVID had been, on the whole, extremely negative or less negative, right? And how it had impacted on different people, particularly around education, particularly around the approvals matching in early stages of an adoptive family. So there were some saying they found it very difficult, they couldn't go to any toddler groups, or they couldn't see the support network, and there was big difficulties for people who could see people with newborns being exempted from some of the social distancing regulations, but with their newly placed children who were not newborns, not getting the same kind of dispensation and being stuck. But on the other hand, some people did say, well, it gave us, we were on furlough, so we were looking, it gave us lots of time to bond and time together as a family, and so that was good. But I think really for me, so because a lot of what the barometer contains is similar to previous years, and we're just looking at comparing data one year to the next and seeing how things have changed. Wales, by the way, big shout out to Wales, because there's been some policy changes in Wales and some injection of funding, and you can actually really see improvements in some of the responses when you just look at Wales on its own. So I mean, it's sort of grist to the mill that when governments do things, improvements happen. But for me, the big story of it is the transition to adulthood section, and the stories of the adopted young people and adults who were gracious enough to share their opinions, views and experiences for that survey, which I'm hugely grateful for.
So we can broadly say that across all the other areas, so perhaps adoption support, matching, placement, approval, it's kind of just as steady as she goes. But in Wales, you saw, was there specific areas they'd put money into, or was it just general money into the system?
In 2019, Wales announced, I can't remember the exact figure, but it was several £1 million towards adoption. It went into different areas. I think some of it went into TESA, I don't want to misspeak and misremember what I actually wrote, but I don't want to misremember this. But what we saw in Wales was, considerable improvements in the speed of access to adoption support. So I'm not saying everybody in Wales has had a perfect time of it. If you're listening in Wales and you think that I'm saying 100% of people in Wales are absolutely thrilled with everything, that's not what happened.
We'll get letters.
Yeah, please don't. If you want to email Alan Scott, that's fine. Just don't email me.
No.
But we did see in Wales really increased speed of access. So the gap, the length of time between phoning your agency and saying we need support and support actually occurring is decreased, and that's really encouraging. And
wonderful.
Indicators of satisfaction with the support that's on offer have increased pretty much across the board in Wales. And in fact, we give the little score of poor, fair and good. I think Wales moved from fair to good overall in a couple of indicators. And I'm pretty strict on the score. I'm a mean teacher. I'm quite strict. If you get, you have to get 80%. It's 80% to get a good, and if you get 79, you're not getting a good. But there were a couple of places where Wales were like on the cusp of good, but not quite there yet. Nearly there. Life story is another thing that Wales does. Gets a lot more positive response rate than elsewhere. But again, they have a really great national strategy for life story. So
your red pen was not out as much for Wales.
Not quite as much.
I mean, that's really interesting.
It's really interesting because I know
national strategy. Let me talk.
Honestly, you've had two questions, and I come in to make a comment rather than ask a question, and then let you crack on because obviously it's your podcast, isn't it? So I was just going to say, 10 years ago, Wales was the complete opposite of this, wasn't it? Well, I don't know if you know that.
I don't know.
I've got friends who've adopted in Wales, and oh dearie me, yeah, it wasn't the best. It really wasn't. I think there's still it's not perfect, but then nothing is perfect, and there's still a few bits and pieces. But that's a really positive.
It is. We look for forward movement. If we look for progress, that's what we look for, and we are seeing it in some. Yeah.
Amazing, brilliant. Well done, Wales.
Well done, Wales. Interesting that they've got a national strategy for life story work. Which
can I just...
Funny, man. It's been a long week. We've spent far too much time together this week. But it feels like that when we talked about the strategy before, and we talked about the RAA lead, that is maybe something that we'll start to see, someone focusing practice in on an issue. There's someone who can get the RAA lead together and say, hey, let's pull out the best practice and level everyone up, to use a well-worn political phrase that's bandied around now.
Yeah, I'm just actually, I know this is ridiculous, but I'm just looking through to see if I can find the page on it, because anyway, they've got a lovely website. I went and read it. It was really great, and it just lays out this is what you should get, and it's just everyone can go and see it. And the National Adoption Service in Wales, I can't find it right now.
Fear ye not, we trust you, we believe you.
Encouraging. Yeah. But you must ask me about the adopted adults. I really want to talk about it.
A deep dive into the
we always like
transition
talking
into
about
adulthood.
that.
Yeah, so I think I really want to take the opportunity. I mean, you can, obviously we're being recorded, so you can cut me out if I go on for too long. But I really want to take the opportunity to talk about it a little bit because it's so I kind of, to some extent, recognise the enormous, how can I put it, just the enormous generosity of people filling in surveys like this to tell us about really personal things with not really a full, maybe, really trusting us that we're going to go and use that data in a way that's going to be, and I really hope we've done it justice, really. But one of the things, we were looking at this transition to adulthood, so we were looking at what happens to young people between the age of 16 and 25. We were looking at what happens before in order to get you to a place at 16, and what kind of preparation adopted young people and families have got in childhood. And then what happens between the age of 16 and 25 in terms of support for adopted young people and support for adoptive parents and families as a whole, really. And one of the things that I was quite interested to try to achieve was to ask some very similar questions to everybody, and to see what differences there were between the different perspectives of the people responding about the type of support that was considered useful.
So is that
I think Al's gonna...
No, just so you're saying you would ask like a parent what would be helpful, then you'd ask an adopted adult, and maybe just as a comparison, really, just to see.
Yeah, really. So what we did was we gave people lists of things that might be, what we called them, protective and supportive factors. List of things that might be considered protective and supportive factors in childhood. The list for parents and adopted adults were not quite the same for that, because for parents we did have some things in that were about job security and things that were more parent relevant, and for our adopted adults there were some things that wouldn't really be relevant for parents, but we gave them both lists and said, can you put these in rank order from what you consider the most important to what you consider the least important? So we can't say that any of them were not considered important, but we can say they were ordered. And then we did the same thing for the 16 to 25 period of transition, and that one we gave parents and adopted adults and young people the same lists. And when I laid out the results, we separated out parents, those adopted young people who were 16 to 25 at the time of doing the survey, and those adopted adults who were over 25 at the time of doing the survey, because I just really wanted to see if there was any difference in the perspectives and whether things changed according to what role you were playing in this and where you were at your stage of life. And there were. So that was interesting.
What were they then? Come on, share with the group.
I think when it came to there was some real congruities. There were some real areas of absolute total agreement. Really, everybody in all the categories agreed that stability, family and friends relationships was the overall most important thing. And I think for me, I felt there's something to be drawn out there about the type of support that's being given to families, and not siloing support. This is just for this is adopted person support and this is adoptive parent support, and these are separate things, and to understand that when families as a whole are supported, it can stabilize relationships, and that can be a huge support, because in the 60 to 25 age group, more than, I think it was 88%, it was more than 80% of young people said that they relied on their adoptive parents as their main source of support. And so really, there needs to be something to support the supporters in that, I think, as well, that came across really clearly. But I think there were other things that were really polarising.
Can I just pause on that? Yeah. I just think that's something that I know that Scott's really spoken in different places about this transition to adulthood. And is that, what do you think about that, Scott? This idea that parents need to be supported to support their children, and the flux around that? Because I know you've danced through this several times, haven't you?
As have you, politely. Mr. Coates.
I think I ignored them for the best part of their...
Well, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because I think that you could make it all about the parents, or you could make it all about the child, or you could kind of split who it's about. I increasingly, more and more, I think that I witness and see, friends and family who have similar age children who have not the same issues but similar issues, and biological children I'm talking about. I'm not talking about kind of adopted or within that kind of cohort. So I think it's really tricky, because I think it depends on the kind of parent that you could be, maybe are, depends on how you take that kind of thing. But in all honesty, I think between the transition from kind of being a teenager to being an adult, I think that's something, and this comes up a lot, actually, and I'm sure it does with you, Becky, as well, and with you, Al, actually, come to that. The thought that, we when we first become parents, we never think beyond 18. We think at 18 that potentially that's when they become independent, or they may kind of dance with the other side of the fence in terms of the green grass that might be greener. Et cetera, all those kind of phrases that I've heard over the years. So it's a tricky one, because yes, we do need support, of course we do, but where does that support start? Where does it end? And also, when at this stage in the process, every single family is absolutely different, and the support will probably look different for every family.
Yeah, but, and I think it's... Sorry, go on, Scott.
No, I was just going to finish off and saying was that we tend to think that, beyond 21 or 25, if you've got an EHCP, that everything's hunky-dory and all happy and fun, and it's not quite the case. We're in a situation with a 23-year-old and 22-year-old, and I'm still parenting them, and not because I have to, but because they want me to. Now there's people who would go out there and say, oh well, they must be fogged adoptees then. If that's the case, then that's fine, but it's that is the way it is, and I'm not just going to leave them high and dry because I think they're fogged. I'm going to try and support them in the best way that I can, and that's it really. But I don't get any support for adopted adults. There's nothing there apart from my community that I engage with. So
yeah. And I think support, when adoptive parents talk about support, they're often talking about, I think sometimes we think about emotional support or adoption support, funded therapeutic support, and I think in the conversation around support around transition to adulthood, we're talking much wider about that. And one of the questions what we asked parents was whether they'd had to do a lot of research and learn a lot of new skills in order to support their young. So there's a lot of stuff around. If your young person is looking to go and live independently, and then they need support with benefits, and they need support with managing their own budget, and they need help with housing, whoever. And my children are not that age, so it's a huge complex world that we haven't made it to yet. But there are a lot of agencies and and groups that that are going to be involved with your adopted young person. And if they do want your help with navigating all of that, it's a huge upskill for everybody, really, isn't it? Just navigating this complicated world of all the services and provision that might be available. And so I think sometimes the support can be really practical, just having the information available to you, so you're not spending hours on the internet chasing down what the form is that your kid needs to fill in for that thing,
Because there's a whole myriad of things, isn't it? Like the transition into adult social care potentially involvement.
Transition from mental health service to adult mental health services.
The disability living allowance or the PIP then transferring to the young person's responsibility. And like you say, I think that I see a lot of people who are just kind of going, well, I was not set up for this. I was like, I feel adrift, and in the middle of all that, there's these big complicated questions about children's capacity, we're probably talking about a small section when we talk about capacity, but even just trusting your children with budgets and things,
or alcohol, or
if the support services are there, if the structures within the services are attuned to the needs of young people who may need extra help, and attuned to the needs of the families who may be helping them, and that the information is there and it's accessible, and it's the pathways through it have been considered and laid out so that it's not just a horrible maze, then whether the young person wants to do it themselves and doesn't want the help of any adults in their life, or whether the adults are supporting, that's there for everybody to access then, isn't it? It's not just about stuff for parents, it's about stuff for everybody that anybody that's involved can access.
Good social work is about empowering people to do it themselves, and so you don't want, none of us really want a social worker to come and fill the form in for us. Well, it depends on the form, sometimes that would be nice, but we want to learn the skills so we can manage this stuff ourselves. We don't particularly want to be betrothed or having to ring post-adoption support worker all the time. We want teachers what to do, but help us. It would be really interesting to see if agencies could put on preparation for adult courses like they did preparation to adopt. But anyway, we're into the long grass. We're only on the first point. Yeah.
And I think as well, when we look at the range of support services that people were accessing, everything, still included support, adoption support, but also other social work teams, mental health services, physical health services, disability services, education, criminal justice services, the housing services, youth services. Some families were involved with a lot of different agencies. And just, and yet within that, adopted adults and young people told us that they were not able to find services that understood their needs as an adopted person. So, there is support out there that's very specifically adoption, but I think once you go outside of the kind of adoption social worker arena, you're in the Wild West, aren't you? And there's just, if you're accessing mental health services, and this came up again and again, and this is something that obviously an adopted person would be much more qualified to speak to than me, but just based on what was said in the surveys, that finding mental health services that are adoption kind of specific, is like...
Yeah. And Ofsted registered as well.
Yeah, so the barriers to accessing it are incredibly high, and just the overwhelming majority couldn't. And I think the other thing that was a huge disparity, and actually, sometimes doing this stuff is upsetting, and just occasionally you'll come across things that are like, gosh, that's just upsetting, really. And there's a fair bit of that in the barometer, because you get a lot of testimony in it, and some of it's, I don't know whether it's under the shield of anonymity, some of it's extremely visceral. But for me, it was a data point that I just found really, really upsetting, which was when we asked parents and adopted young people and adults what support they thought would have been useful during childhood. And then the second question we asked as a follow-up, we listed the same supports and said, which did you actually get? Which of these did you actually have access to during childhood? And the respondents that were over 25, the adopted adults, it was horrendous. Nothing, almost none of it. I think 56% said they'd had none of it. And we're talking things like school staff who understand the needs of adopted children, social emotional wellbeing support in school, help with mental health, help with maintaining birth family contacts, all of the, a mentor or a buddy or some kind of support group, all of these kinds of things. And well over half of the adopted adults over 25 said that they couldn't access any of those things during their childhood. I mean, it was a better picture for the younger respondents, but you just think, as what one of the adopted adults said, and it's quoted in the report, but it was something like, services for us as adopted adults are virtually non-existent, and for most of us, they didn't exist when we were children either. And I mean, it's a really bleak.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to think that we've progressed at least a little bit in that, and I think we have, but
I mean, the data of this, which is obviously not representative of the entire adoption community, 159 respondents, but certainly all the younger respondents reported a much higher rate of engagement with all the protective and supportive factors. Still not, I'm still under half in some cases, but at least some.
But it's horrendous to think that the lack of that for the kind of older adoptees, I don't know how to word that, the older adoptees, how that may have impacted them now, the fact that there was no support and they couldn't access support and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, and I think I really want to say that, sorry, Scott.
No, go on.
This is really important. I'm aware that this is not new information. There may be older adopted people listening to this now and going, well, for goodness sake, we've been shouting about this for years. So I'm not presenting this as like, look what we've discovered. We didn't discover this at all. This has been spoken about for a very long time. And my feeling is that, what can I say? I know that the Adoption Barometer is read by people that work at the DFE and are involved in those things. So it feels like a small contribution to saying, to backing up what's been being said for a long time, really, not in any way to say that we've discovered this.
No,
but it's important, isn't it? Because we can draw lots of anecdotal information, and that has potency, and that's important. That lived experience, but data is people respond to data differently, don't they? Yeah. And I was thinking about this. There's a generation of children, young adults now, who sort of the generation where the children from the beginning of the Children Act, who've probably the children who have experienced the worst reasons to come into care. Not relinquished, which is, it's all degrees of terrible, but relinquished is probably the least traumatic of all of the routes into care. And so children who've then experienced the worst, but the systems were still just in place for those children who'd been relinquished. So, children have experienced abuse and neglect and trauma, and we've sort of boiled it down to that cohort, but just not provided services. Just kind of thought, it's just like everyone else, they'll be fine. Just don't talk about adoption and it'll all be okay. So they're breaking the ice, aren't they, everywhere they go, that like even as adults now, they're the ones that are saying there's nothing for us. And I saw this week on Twitter, it's been again and again, I don't know whether it's just what I've picked up on, but people saying there was nothing for me as an adult. There's nothing out there for me. adoption is lifelong, and it's the strategy sort of hinted at that, but more than it did in the last one. So it's a move.
I acknowledge the existence of adopted adults, let's say, which I think is good. I think I also think something that was really strongly came across to me in the looking at the data from these three groups: the adopted parents, the younger adopted people, and the adopted adults over 25. That on some issues there is a huge amount of polarisation of view. So some of them are absolutely clear cut. Adopted young people and adults all massively valued adoptive parents who were open and honest and were able to speak to them about all aspects of being adopted. And again, there is work to be done with adoptive parents to ensure that they're in the position to be able to do that, but that was so important. So some things were absolutely no-brainers that everybody agreed with. Younger adopted respondents had a lot to say about education, and in fact of the top 4 ranked things of importance, 3 of them were education related for 16 to 25 year olds. But then in other things there was huge polarization. Do you want to guess what was hugely polarized? One of the main polarized things?
Contact.
Yes. Absolutely. And I think this is where we just need to draw back from, whereas Adoption UK as an organisation that very much works with adoptive families, even despite all the thousands of members and the many, many surveys that I have done and all of that, we must acknowledge that in some of these subjects there isn't one voice. And I think, within the 159 adopted young people and adults that responded to that survey, there wasn't one voice on that either. And in fact, it really interested me that for those over 25, when they were asked to rank in order of importance these protective and supportive factors during the age of 16 to 25, one of them was support to begin or maintain relationships with birth family members. And that was considered more important amongst older adopted respondents. But 22% ranked this as the number 1 most important thing, and 29% ranked it as the least important thing.
Wow, okay.
So there's no one voice, is there? With
the spread across the middle. Wow. And I think, I tried to be really honest about this in the writing of the report, that both among adoptive parents and among adopted people that responded, and again, I just must emphasise, I'm not claiming that this represents the entire adoptive person community, it obviously can't, but and I put quotes in from actual quotes for both of these, that we have adoptive parents saying, we don't want any direct contact, it wouldn't be right, I can't understand why everyone wants it all the time. And right next to that, an adoptive parent saying direct contact should be considered, and why aren't you doing something more about direct contact? But then again, amongst adopted respondents, we had polarisation of views. We had respondents saying, I can't answer a lot of these questions because I don't feel I need any extra help due to being adopted. And then the next breath would be somebody saying, and I think I put this quote in, adoption is cruel. You want to help families stop adoption. And so there was, I'm saying that partly to show that there was a range of views. It wasn't, I think there's sometimes this sense that it's only the certain kind of people that fill in these surveys, but actually there was quite a big range of views and people very strongly expressing those views. But I think for me what it says is when we're talking about things like contact like that, we can't rely on people's feelings about what should have, would have, or could have happened. We need some proper longitudinal, we need more decent academic longitudinal research to actually understand, and I know some of it's being done and that's great, but I think relying on a collection of, we just can't rely on a collection of anecdotes and feelings about things and assume that this collection of anecdotes represents the sum total of a community's experience, because what I see in this, and I want to be clear, because somebody ranked it as least important doesn't mean they think it's unimportant. They just thought the other things are more important. So I'm not trying to suggest that 29% of adoptive adults have no interest in, or that may be true, but that's not what the figures tell us. It just tells us they didn't think it was as important as some of the other things. But it just creates challenges going forward in trying to create systems for this that will be the best fit for everybody, and I'm glad I'm not in charge of doing that, basically. Well,
the contact is a great example of an issue that is just every view is different, and because every circumstance is different.
Exactly.
And as you say, people can't, how can any of us look back in anything and say, I wish I'd had more of this accurately or less of this? Because we just don't. We're here because of what happened. It's a really hard question to answer, and it can change. And I know that, I've got 6 children, and all of them have unique experiences, but also unique perspectives on contact. You could ask them, and they, like you say, they're polarizing views as well. Some of them are extreme, and some of them are kind of like meh. And so it's just you like you say, how do you build a system that can embrace all of those complex needs? I don't know. We've done ourselves out of a job.
It's hard, isn't it? It's hard.
But I think I would say that, though. I think we can certainly improve what there is. And I think we can certainly sort of say, well, look, 22% of over 25s thought that support to begin and maintain relationships with birth family members was the most important thing they needed during the age of 16 to 25. And that's more than 1 in 5. So ensuring the services that are available to support young people through that, if that's what they want, and it's likely that 1 in 5 of them do, by the looks at least. I'm sure more, but I've ranked it as most important. Ensuring the services are in place doesn't mean everybody has to avail themselves of the services. But if the services are not in place, nobody can access the services, and so. It needs to be done. We had all kinds of parents, people saying, oh, well, my child got to 18 and they wrote to us and said, letterbox has stopped now because they're 18. So we wrote back and said, well, what next? And they were like, oh, nothing. That can't be. What is that? Really?
Yeah. That's madness, isn't it? So just to kind of move on a little bit, and I'm just going to mention them, and if you want to briefly, I keep saying this to you, Becky, briefly, because I know that you could talk for hours about this stuff, and that's no criticism. That's just saying we've only got a certain amount of time. So introduced ring-fenced multi-year government funding for adoption support. Now this is an issue for years, isn't it? They keep on doing this like financial year thing in terms of like funding for children and young people all over, actually, not just in adoption and fostering. How important how important did that rate
in terms of
as an issue? As an issue, all right. So it wasn't one of the protective and supportive factors we talked. So it's not related to that what we were just talking about. But it's a hugely important issue, and it's something that Adoption UK. It's a question that is asked a lot at various, as you'll know, at various meetings. The response at the moment is around, it's been COVID, so but this will never stop being an issue because I think actually the last time I was on the podcast, we discussed the difficulties that support providers were facing, not knowing if the funding was going to be cut off after the end of March last year, and around about Christmas time, wondering whether they needed to start issuing redundancy notices because they didn't know if they'd be able to pay people, and they needed to give people 3 months' notice. It's that kind of thing. It's not just, it's inconvenient for those it's more than inconvenient, but it's the uncertainty for families, but it's also the uncertainty for the agencies that are supposed to be providing this support. People need a longer term commitment than that. I think we're saying long term, we're saying minimum 10 years, we're saying those kind of things, but I think there's a spending review, and I think we've got to wait until then, if I'm remembering the governmenty thing that I'm supposed to know about. Who's the Prime Minister? Actually, don't answer that because I don't want to hear that name.
No.
Let's not go there.
But so I think I think short-termism is the order of the day, isn't it? But we can perhaps hope for more when the proper spending review takes place. But
we would hope, especially after the strategy this week, because that was obviously committing to a certain amount of money, but that was already committed to in some ways. But anyway, So, produce support plans for every child to be placed for adoption, agreed with adopters before placement, anticipating future as well as current support needs, and annually reviewed. I think it's that last bit that I was kind of intrigued by, annually reviewed, spotted. Because I tell you, I'm good. We would hope that there's a support plan in place, but they're possibly never relevant to the child that you've got 6 months later.
No, and actually more than 70% of newly placed adopters told us they didn't have a written support plan in place.
Wow.
Okay. But I mean, I think that's a more complicated picture than it looks. I think if your written support plan is 2 lines on the child CPR, you might not have recognised that it exists unless someone draws your attention to it and says, this is your child support plan. My first child, the support plan was a couple of lines on the CPR, and it basically said, this child's very young and fine and doesn't need any support.
Yeah.
And that was the support plan. Because I think support plans are quite often written with the very immediate future in place, and this is why we haven't done this before, but we featured a case study of a regional adoption agency in the report, which and we're not saying this is the only regional adoption agency doing this, but this regional adoption agency had a bit of a thing during COVID and thought, hang on a minute, we're having to move to virtual meetings. This is not great. You know, when new children moved into families and we can only visit virtually and we're going to have to cut down the face-to-face, this feels risky. So what they did was they did have a program for a sort of multidisciplinary, or certainly a team around a team sort of meeting. They did have a procedure for that for children that were likely to have higher support needs, and they would just do it for those children prior to placement, to do a really good strategic meeting and do a really strong report, like multi-page report we'll do this in 3 months, and after 6 months we'll do this, that kind of thing. And what they did was
review you would have for that sounds
kind of, and with support built in, optional. Parents, nobody was mandated to go on it, but after 6 weeks you'll be offered this online training event, and after 3 months you'll be offered this other thing, and after 6 months you'll be offered, and so sort of a strategy for the first year or two built in, an option to review and see how things were going. And this had been something they had done previously with a proportion of children that they were placing, but during COVID they extended it to include all children that they were placing, and this was over 160 children, I think. And I think in an average year they said they placed over 160 children. And actually they've been so pleased with it and how it's gone. And there were other things as well, that they used some of the emergency funding to really upskill and do training with the staff and a lot of things like that. So really they would, it was a meeting, whereas before, for the majority of children, the support plan would just be written by the child social worker, and it would be fairly... Well, it would just be written by the child social worker. These new ones, I was trying to not say that because it seems a bit... I haven't read any of them. I don't know if they were generic. But actually, weirdly, it's the RA that I would be in now. That I would be adopting through now if I was adopting now, but didn't exist when I adopted. So it was very interesting for me on that thing. But they've extended it, and actually, even though it's more in terms of time and meetings and that, they're so pleased with the outcomes. In terms of like feedback from matching panel saying these adopters seem much more prepared and this paperwork is much better than it used to be, and we love these support, they're actually going to carry that on. And so, we think this is something that clearly can be done. And I think reviewed annually is a bit of a, because you don't necessarily want a social worker trotting around to your house every year.
But you want the option.
But a phone call to say how things going, do you want us to review your support plan with you? I don't think it,
Yeah, I think that's right, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think social work's changed. I think one of the things we found is like professionally, is that we can do an awful lot more because we're not, I'm not having to spend an hour to get to your office, an hour to get back. To be honest, I write my minutes while I'm in the Zoom meeting. I can type them up. And there are lots of meetings where I don't need to be present. I don't need to be physically present. Of course, there are some meetings that are really beneficial and help. It can be. It's just important to sit in someone's living room and have a cup of tea. Sometimes, like that meeting you described, it's a virtual meeting, or even we've done it hybrid where someone's rocked up to the house with a laptop, had a chit chat, and then put the laptop on, and we've all had a meeting together. So it just seems like that stuff's more doable. The profession's got a bit more creative and a bit more savvy.
And we did get some feedback of some people saying, look, we've been able to access things, we've been able to speak to professionals more than we could before, because instead of having to arrange a meeting and have babysitters and all of this stuff, take ages off work to travel to the venue and come back, it's just a half-hour Zoom conversation or whatever it is you're using, and they've been able to access training more because, again, they're not having to get babysitters, they're not having to travel. Geographically, some areas are pretty big, and the travel time, but they are some of them, and
like coast to coast.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, well, even my RAA, which is quite geographically small, it's a really urban area, so it might only look like it's 12 miles away, but that's going to take you 40 minutes to get to if it's sort of tea time.
Practical, is it?
So it just adds a lot of babysitting time and hassle, and I've got to finish work early. So there were some people that said, it's like you said, Ali, it's not always appropriate, but for some things it can actually increase people's access.
That's encouraging.
Yeah,
but actually, the one you highlighted, Scott, we've asked for that for years. We just word it. We keep wording it in various ways.
Yeah.
But we
see if someone will pick up on it one day.
Yeah, but again, you see, and again, it's the level at which it's done. You can mandate it in statutory guidance, or you can just show the RAAs a really great example of it and see if they pick it up. So there's there's different ways of getting it to happen, but.
But it doesn't all have to be done sat in someone's lounge, like Al said. Sometimes it's good for that, and especially for support and stuff. But actually, if you're doing a review, to do a half-hour Zoom with a parent, if they're willing to take part, then an annual kind of check-in like that would be quite easy, wouldn't it? So yeah.
The things we've also found is people, for example, if someone works, they can just nip into the staff room or the car park for half an hour on their phone and get Teams on their phone and do it. So it just it opens. I feel like it.
Yeah.
Those that have embraced it, it's been wonderful, and hopefully we can use that. I'm conscious we've talked for an hour.
We have. Can I just ask for one more thing before I let you ask your priorities, Al? Because I'm interested in the fetal alcohol syndrome disorder point. So it said train all education and health professionals in early childhood trauma and associated conditions, including fetal alcohol disorder and attachment disorder. So how kind of prominent did that come up? I mean, obviously, clearly it's quite prominent because it's within the summary recommendations. But was it a big thing again?
The fetal alcohol spectrum disorder wasn't covered in the depth in this barometer that it was in the last barometer. So we did we did this in focus thing in last year's barometer. In a way, I would like to, but you can't keep putting all the questions from the InFocus in every subsequent barometer.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
It already takes the poor respondents about 40 minutes to fill the survey in, and I'm desperately trying to avoid survey fatigue. But I think pretty much since I've worked at Adoption UK, which is knocking on, it's a few years now, improving the standards of training at all levels of education has been a massive thing of mine, and it is a challenging thing to achieve, not least because there is some resistance in some parts of the profession, not least because there is resourcing problems and there are capacity problems, not least because it's debatable whether a half-day training for teachers is really the gold standard of what's going to create, but at least having heard of FASD would be an excellent start, I feel.
Exactly.
So then there's for FASD particularly, the lack of awareness of its even existence is a huge barrier. But I think the routes into ensuring that training is being given in education are difficult, because actually, although there is like a core content guidance, I'm talking about England now, there's like core content guidance for initial teacher training and what they call now the early career framework, which is 2 years of additional stuff you get on the job afterwards. Although there's like guidance around what should be in there, these are delivered by independent teacher training institutions, certainly the initial teacher training, and the government doesn't dictate to them word by word what should be on the syllabus that they're teaching, and so finding ways in to encourage this to happen at initial teacher training in the early career framework is, it's challenging. But we've got some specific things we're asking for in regard to that. But I think when I think back to when I became a teacher, which was in the mid-90s, there was really a lot of talk in the teacher profession around whether autism was really a thing. Is autism really a thing? Is it not just children that have watched too much TV, or is it not just an excuse for children who don't behave, or there was an enormous amount of talk around that? And I did go on.
Actually, it
was whatever it was. There was a lot of, that kind of talk and some resistance. And I did go on a half-day training course as a fairly early qualified teacher about, it was called Asperger's then. about Asperger's in schools, and it was instructive, and it didn't fully equip me after that to go and be an amazing teacher of children on the autistic spectrum, but at least I'd heard of it and I knew what it was, and I knew that it was a thing and not just a made up name for children that didn't behave or for whatever. But that is really where things were. So I think there is some value in the sort of low level awareness raising training to even get the conversation going. And I think in some, with FASD, there is particularly some value for that, because I don't think it's widely accepted I don't think it's just widely known about. And if you have heard of it, understanding what it actually means.
To be fair, if you've heard of it, you've probably been affected by it, or someone has literally put the stuff in front of you, haven't it? And it takes me back 15, 20 years ago. Attachment was fairly new to the UK. It was a thing in America, but it took a long time for it to get here. And now people acknowledge it. So you have to kind of...
With all of these things, there's like a period where we don't know what it is, and then loads of information comes and we use it in questionable ways. Strange things occur, and then it gets poo-pooed because, this is questionable and strange, and then eventually we sort of bed ourselves down into something that is a little more realistic and manageable. And I think, we'd be looking to achieve that in some in some like utopian future.
I think it's a really helpful document, and I think that I was looking through, and the thing that sort of I really liked was in relation to families with older adopted children. And I think I really, really liked your recommendations, which were extend adoption support to at least age 26. It's just a yes. I mean, it's a mega bucks because it's lots of money, but it just seems that for the families that I know, those years remain complicated and challenging in new ways. Improve transition services into adult services, training and peer support for all adopters when the children reach 13. I think that's where I've got all of my help from, is from my friends. And the last one was establish an adoption youth advisory. Well, people that Paula knows.
All right, okay.
Yeah. It's not. Let's not believe anything untoward about me. Establish Adoption Youth Advisory Board to the nation. It just seems like that we just need to broaden the scope of what we give to families, because that is just but we sort of touched on that. I think it's great. So you're doing another one next year, and what you're focusing on next year, or has that not been decided yet?
We do not. We haven't decided. We've had some conversations, but I can say that in the initial conversation we've had, there is a general consensus that we would really like to go out to the adopted adult community again. It's a question of having the sort of synergy between what we're investigating and what people's experiences are, I guess. If we were to, we wouldn't do this currently, but if we were to say we're doing in focus on, your experiences of the first 6 months as an adoptive family, that might be a more parent-focused conversation, obviously, but we'd be unlikely to do that. My preference is to look to focus on something that's of relevance to adoptive families, and where the contribution of those who are adopted adults would make a real huge difference to the conversation, and to go and ask them, and also to to sort of network more widely before the questions are done this time. So we did go out to adopted adult groups last time and get feedback on help to write the questions and feedback on the questions when they were done. But I'd like to do that more widely this time as well, really. But I don't know what it's going to be. We've got a few ideas. What do you think, guys?
Don't ask us. We're just simpletons.
We're sheep. We just go where we're pointing towards, basically.
I mean, there's a few sort of obvious. I mean, contact's an obvious one, but unfortunately, when you do a big thing on contact, it's going to be picked up by the media, and the story they want to tell is a disaster story. Yeah. You can't get a nuanced conversation about it, which doesn't mean we shouldn't investigate it. We just need to know that we're going to be weathering that afterwards, and that all the families and all the adopted young people are going to have to see those stories in the news afterwards, and those stories keep being in the news anyway, and I'm not sure how helpful it is for everybody all of the time. I mean, obviously those are real things that happen, but it's but I think context is something that always comes up as an option because it's such an important priority for people. But there are other things too.
Well, we'll have a think. We'll put our heads together and then we'll send you an email and then.
I'm sure your listeners will.
I'm sure. Yeah,
have suggestions. And honestly, I'm interested in all suggestions because what the infocus section is meant to be is a deep dive into a narrow area that gives us data and perspectives that would be difficult to get otherwise.
Yeah.
And a chance for people to get stuff off their chests about that, really.
Yeah, I mean, I wondered whether mental health would maybe something that's a bit generic, but I think that across all, like even mental health in children, I think is a really complicated issue because we see often stuff is just through a behavioralist lens. That child is misbehaving, but actually that child might be unwell, struggling, anxious, which it makes sense. But I think that I wondered if that would be something because that does transition into adulthood, and that would be an adopted adult's perspective on that, and young adults' perspective on that. My phone's just pinged. I've got to self-isolate for 5 days.
Oh. Let's carry on.
Really?
Let's carry on talking for 5 days.
Yeah, we've got 5 days.
So let's just stay. We've got 5 days. I think.
Has it really said that?
Yeah. It's going to be a podcastathon.
Oh no!
I can't tell you what
working.
Scott's face has done. Scott's face has just melted.
I know. I'm just saying I'm busy. All right, I'm working. I've got guests for the first time in 18 months. You are not spoiling my weekend, Coates. So don't even think about it. Unlike this kitten who's arrived in the room and keeps on climbing on my shoulder. But yeah. Oh, so who have you been? Where have you been now, Coates? And I saw you a couple of days. So this is concerning. So we need to talk about this after the podcast because I obviously don't have the NHS app because I don't live there.
As my mother would say, she'd be worried that I've been out kissing mucky women. That's what my mother would say.
Yeah, well, if you weren't married to Mrs. C, I'd probably agree. But there you go.
Yeah. Oh, well, I think on that note, I've got to go and have some serious conversations with some grown-ups. I think it's all gone very wrong. Yeah. I'm due to be somewhere very soon, and that's knackered me up.
Yeah, you're not going anywhere, mate.
No, I'm stuck in.
Becky, thank you.
Damn.
Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. It's always a joy and a pleasure.
It's always lovely to see you and always lovely to chat.
Yeah, and well done, because actually, as much as we laugh at you being a policy stat wonk, you are... I think the community, this stuff really matters to the community, and it drives the discussion, and well, let's hope it drives policy as well.
Good. Yeah. Well, you may have noticed it was mentioned liberally in the adoption strategy. I was like underlining the mentions of it. But yeah, I wrote that. My highlight of my career actually was when Timpson mentioned it. I think he mentioned it in Parliament, and he mentioned it in his report about school exclusions. One or the other of those, and I was like, I'm famous now. This is the big time for me.
You can rest on your laurels. That is absolutely wonderful.
I'm done.
Yeah. How's that going for you? How's retirement going for you? On that
as if.
Thank you, Becky.
Bless your heart.
Appreciate it.
Okay, Bon Jovi.
Anchovy.
Oh, I can't think of anything that rhymes with Chovy. Chovy.
Oh, it's been a long night.
I think that's a good ending point, honestly.
Yes, it is.
We are. I mean,
pinged in the middle of this album.
It's all going. It's all falling apart now. We've maintained a veneer of respectability and professionalism for over an hour. It's more than could reasonably be expected.
Can you stop talking?
It's hard to tell when he's freezing.
Can you hear me? Because no. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Clearly not.
Yeah.
Can you hear me? No, seriously, because it just all the settings just changed when I switched the light on. Shut up, both of you. I just switched the light on and it flicked up on my computer and said all my settings had changed. So I'm not happy.
Do.
Crikey. Not been out of the house in very long.
Oh. It's after 3 nights with you, that's what's done it. Not physically, just in case anybody was wondering.
It's not live, you know.
No, I know that. I'm just saying to Becky.
I wasn't wondering.
That's all right
All
then.
right, you're fine.
Do you see these bags under my eyes? That's 3 days. Three nights, 4 days with Al.
That's mainly because my 9-year-old snores so loud through the walls.
Oh my days! Seriously, I've never heard something so small make so much noise when it's sleeping. Bless her heart. Right. Anyway, I'm ready. I'm ready to rock. We're ready to rock.
Okay, go for it.
Fabulous. Well, hello and welcome to episode 123. That's